But Emily either could not or would not abandon the themes and characters of her fantasy world of Gondal, and she simply transported a violent childhood tale of passion and revenge to a rural Yorkshire setting.
My novel is called Wuthering Heights. Let me in, or I will make you repent, Gurnt Heathcliff. If I were you, I'd go stretch myself over Cathy's grave and die like a faithful dog. I can't imagine how you think of surviving her loss. I was unnerved by terror when Heathcliff flung himself on Earnshaw's weapon and wrenched it from his grasp. The charge exploded, and the knife closed into its owner's wrist. Heathcliff pulled it away by main force, slitting up the flesh, and thrust it dripping into his pocket. His adversary had fallen senseless with pain. The ruffian kicked and trampled on him and dashed his head repeatedly against the flags.
While the sisters were busy with their novels, some long-awaited news roused Branwell from his depression.
Brandy. John, have some brandy. This calls for a celebration. You see before you the happiest philosopher that ever lived.
What's happened then?
He's dead. Isn't it wonderful? Providence has smiled on us.
Who's dead?
Robinson. I know not how and care less. Before long, I shall be the husband of the lady whom I love best in all the world. A toast to the philosopher and his future bride. And another, that when I marry, I might be a gentleman of leisure and devote myself to poetry.
Poetry.
It took the sisters only 2 months to finish their novels, and they sent them off with new hope of finding fame and fortune. A sudden summons to the Black Bull from Mrs. Robinson's coachman sent Branwell into ecstasy.
This was his moment. He was convinced that in a day or so he'd be back with his Lydia. He stayed with that coachman for 2 hours, and then landlord sent for me. Something had started to burn up inside him, fierce-like. He was having some kind of fit. The coachman told him Robinson's will said if his wife ever saw Branwell again, she'd inherit nothing. I took him back to parsonage, and it were my last Martha, parson's maid, who had to look after him.
My pa found out later it was all a lie. Her husband's will said no such thing. Mrs. Robinson had made it all up. Wasn't 5 minutes before she went off and married a wealthy relative. But our Bramwell, he was broken, heart and mind.
My son had broken the 7th commandment and was being punished on earth for his sin, but 'twas that woman tempted him, and she would reap her reward in hell.
Either to ease her conscience or to buy his silence, Mrs. Robinson continued to send Branwell money. He squandered it all on drink, weakening his already fragile health, until his sisters lost all patience. Charlotte's hopes for their novels had been dashed. Finally, an unscrupulous publisher called Thomas Courtly Newby offered to print them at the girl's expense. He demanded the sum of £50, nearly £2,000 in today's money. Emily and Anne agreed, but Charlotte parcelled up her manuscript for the 7th time and sent it to Smith Elder and Company.
These were mournful days. Papa's cataracts had become so bad that he was almost helpless. I decided that Emily and I would go to Manchester to find an eye surgeon who could perform the new and delicate operation needed to restore his sight.
Patrick's cataract operation was carried out before the days of anaesthetic. The old man sat patient and firm for 15 minutes of excruciating pain while they removed the complete lens from his eye. After the ordeal, Patrick was ordered to lie quietly for a month to prevent bleeding. Charlotte stayed to nurse him, but while Patrick prayed silently for the restoration of his sight, she found that time hung heavily on her hands.
I had a raging toothache and could neither sleep nor eat, so I took up a pencil and paper and sought refuge in my writing. I imagined an orphan child, and I called her Jane Eyre. She becomes a governess and falls in love with her employer, Mr. Rochester.
In writing Jane Eyre, Charlotte released all the pent-up passion that had tortured her soul for 4 years. Like Monsieur Heger, Mr. Rochester was married. But unlike Charlotte, Jane Eyre's love was requited.
I love you as my own flesh. I entreat you. Jane, I must have you for my own. Entirely my own.
Jane flees the agonizing temptation of her love for a married man. Returning later, she finds he has been blinded in a fire that has killed his secret wife, leaving them free to marry at last.
Jane,
I'm coming back to you.
such dreams I've had at night when I've clasped her to my heart as I do now and kissed her.
Through divine mercy and skill of the surgeon, after a year of nearly total blindness, I was able to read and write and find my way without a guide. The restoration of my sight was a miracle. And I prayed for another to save my son from his torment.
While Branwell pined for Mrs. Robinson, Charlotte was appalled to hear gossip that Arthur Bell Nichols was pining for her.
Never was rumour more unfounded. A cold, far-away sort of civility are the only terms on which I have ever been with Mr. Nichols.
Mr. Bell Nichols?
He and his fellow curates regard me as an old maid, and I regard them, one and all, as narrow and unattractive specimens of the coarser sex.
Mr. Bell Nichols.
She was more worried about her fictional romance.
Smith Elder had rejected the professor, but they discussed its faults and merits so kindly and with such courteousness that I take more pleasure in their refusal than in a thoughtless acceptance. They say a new work in 3 volumes will meet with their careful attention. I'm sending them Jane Eyre.
Well, I hope you have more success than we have had with Newby.